For me, digital watches are the best example of all different kinds of technology being combined together over time in weird and wonderful ways to produce an awesome variety of different products. Sometimes this is a matter of small gradual steps of incremental innovation. Sometimes there are giant leaps with a new technology unlocking new doors of possibility. This got me thinking of the technology tree as typified within the 1996 masterpiece Sid Meier's Civilization 2, hence the not so subtle theme for this video. We will explore examples of the technology of digital watch display, use of digital watches for sport and activities, mechanisms for accurate timekeeping, use of computation, creative design, power generation, use of sensors, and use of sound and sources of entertainment. As with Civ 2, I will look to show you the unfolding story of the brands, exploring these different technology applications, and pick out some of the wonders of watchdom that arose from their industry. See if you can guess what they're going to be as we go along. The start of the Civ 2 technology tree is the alphabet, and the digital watch equivalent once the quartz-based movement was in place was the digital display. First we have the LED display with 1970s Pulsar time computer, our first official wonder of watchdom, with the likes of Fairchild Semiconductor and Hughes Aircraft enabling the LED craze across the US, Japan and indeed within Switzerland with 1972's Omega time computer. LED would be a badge of worldwide technological advancement, for example with Soviet Russia and the Electronica 1 in 1973, Poland with 1978's Unitrol Varel, and even Britain with the 1975 Sinclair Blackwatch, one of our very few mentions as a civilization here, which I think's a real shame. The first LCD tech would be liquid crystal scattering light forward within a range of so-called dynamic scattering mode display watches enabled by Optel in 1972, growing out of tech developed at RCA Labs, who take the crown as our second wonder of watchdom. Other DCM providers would be Intel-owned Microma from 1972, as well as the Clepsydra from Texas Instruments and Longines. But the origin of the majority of today's digital watches is the twisted pneumatic LCD display, which exploits the fact that liquid crystal can be twisted between two polarizers, which makes the light passing through do likewise when no voltage is applied. When you apply voltage, this makes the crystal rods straighten out, with the light no longer being able to pass through the second polarizer, and then you get nice dark segments that can form numbers. Either developed by Elixco or Roche, long story, will split the third watches of wonder between them. This would be used in 1972 by Gruen Teletyme, with Seiko adding the second digits in 1973 with the 06 LC, and most of the rest piling in around 1974 with Casio's QW02 in Casiotron range, Citizen's 90104, Timex 75 LCD, Ricoh's 819, and Orient 6200. What was at the time Soviet Russia in modern-day Belarus was the Electronica 5, which was available from around 1980, with the then German Democratic Republic having ruler LCD watches from 1978. Now we could do more than just display numbers though, and from pretty early on in 1972, Suncrux had developed an LCD watch that displayed time in an analog format. Even Rolex had some early prototypes of pseudo-analog with a Rolex Fan project in 1978. In a more mainstream format, Texas Instruments produced a pseudo-analog display in 1979, with the 1980 Seiko G757 being an icon due to its later bond link. Citizen were in on the game too, with the 9560, as well as Orient with the super cool sound monitor 77110540, nicknamed Double Face, and the recently reissued Timex Q-Time liquid crystal analog in 1987. Different ways of forming numbers such as dot matrix from Seiko in 1980, additional graphics in models like the 1986 Casio Twin Graph, and the pure madness that is Tokyo Flash and related watches from around 2000 provide illustrations of other imaginative uses of the digital watch display beyond just the time. But what about combining analog hands with a digital display in an Ana-Digi or Digi-Ana watch? Citizen were the innovators here in 1978 with the 8900 Digi-Ana, with popular models from Seiko including the 1979 H127 and 1981 H239 robot model. The Ricoh 140 series is one of my personal favourites, which really squeezes the two in side by side. A more reverso-esque spin on the concept was the Omega Equinox, where you could flip between the analog and digital faces. And in the diving context, a notable Ana-Digi is the Seiko Arnie model from 1982. The Ana-Digi concept goes very flight watch centric from around 1985 with the introduction of the Breitling Navitimer digital model, later aerospace and emergency models, and things like the 1999 Citizen Navitac and 2008's U700. The ultimate for me is the space-oriented model, the Omega X33 from 1998, which had its origins in their 1987 Seamaster multifunction, with alternative modern offerings being 2010's held a model with changeable modules between analog and digital. An alternative spin on the concept is the Casio TwinSept, where an LCD display can hover over the analog display. My favourite is their use of it within the ProTrek range, with active dial technology often used in edifices being the spiritual successor of this from around 2006. But what about when you're trying to read your display in the dark? Well, from the 70s we already had little buttons that activated a relatively pathetic little LED light. A cool tech based upon tritium strips was Beta Light from around 1976 with the Sensor Light model. The same technology in 1978 was developed in prototype versions of an Omega 1621 Alaska 4 project LCD watch that was being considered for the space program. But 1992's Timex Indiglo brings everyone's favourite blue light and our fourth wonder, the product of a layer of phosphor that releases energy as a cold light rather than hot heat when a voltage is applied, the science of electroluminescence. Casio would jump on the bandwagon in 1994 with Foxfire in Japan, or Illuminator outside of Japan, with Armatron's version being the Instalight in the Allsport range. Other advancements before we later descended backwards on the backlight front due to electroluminescence eating battery for breakfast, with a combination with the green tinged film by Timex to form All Day Indiglo in 1996, and the automatic EL backlight around the same time, used by Casio within the ProTrek range and by Timex as Flix technology. Micro-encapsulated electrophoretic display, or e-ink, was a cool technology that span out of MIT in 1997. After initial use in things such as Amazon Kindle, the same e-ink technology would be used by Seiko in prototypes from around 2004. Some more obscure brands such as Phosphor and ODM also used this, and eye-catchingly it was used in 2010's Seiko Active Matrix e-ink watch. Within the same realm of e-paper style displays, 2013's Pebble Watch used Sharp's Memory LCD, which more recently looks to be called Memory in Pixel, where each pixel has allocated memory, which enables it to use less power and have more contrast. These read super clear and can be seen on the Casio GPR B100, GBD 100 and 200 range from 2018 onwards, as well as 2020's Nixon High Tide, and more recently their Regulus range. 2013's Qualcomm TOC utilised a Mirasol display using interferometric modulation technology, which enabled use of colours, but it didn't seem to take off. The final display tech we'll mention for now is organic light emitting diode, where the LEDs light up themselves rather than being backlit. I believe Sony Ericsson's LiveView in 2010 used an OLED display, but it would become more mainstream with 2014's Samsung Galaxy Gear, where OLED would be used in the way we know it today, with 2015 deploying flexible OLED that could be bent. Conk apparently recently launched the first micro LED watch, so let's see where the others go from here. For us to use our digital watches within sporting context and for other activities, we would need more functions, some resistance to the elements, and tailoring to specific sports. So let's dig into the different technology that enabled this. A key feature for sports is of course the chronograph, with the pioneers here being the Hoyer Chronosplit in 1975, and Omega with the 1976 Chrono Quartz. Seiko's 0634 is a true multi-function watch with chronograph, and Orient had the 1976 61100, Chronograph 20, Ricoh the 821 dual time chronograph, and Casio the Casiotron X1 and QW37 and 38. Timex had the Marathon with stopwatch, and Sanyo launched the Chrono Lithium in 1980. Precision would increase with the craziness of the 1 in 1000 second timing with the Casio DW6000 in 1989, and a fun deployment of this simple tech is 1988's Seiko Racing Master. A different tech is the digital tachometer, which enables the measurement of speed, with Seiko's 1989 Giugiaro designed SBJG011 from 1989, and 1990's Casio DW400 having this capability too. Anti-shock, parashock and such terms had been used in the world of analog watches from early days, with Timex having its torture tests and Citizen dropping its parashock watches from helicopters in 1956. The equivalent within the digital world was 1983's DW5000 G-Shock Square, our fifth watch of wonder. Various bolt-ons would include 1994's Capsule Tough in the DW001 Jason watch, the metal version with 1996's MRG, and more recent reinforcements such as 2019's Carbon Core. Outside of blatant copies like the Citizen P130, affectionately nicknamed the C-Shock by one of my subscribers, Timex's more recent answer to this seems to be the Command series, and collaborations like the Humvee, which are in the same universe, with Nixon having the Regulus model. Mud resistance arguably began with the 1985 G-Shock 2, with mud-resistant buttons, but this would be fully realised with the 1995 Mudman, which reached its full glory with the beast that is the 2016 Mudmaster GWG 1000. The sporting pursuit where timing is key is of course running with jogging watches. The plastic lightweight Casio F100 was framed as being a jogging watch, but it was 1984's Casio Pace Runner that would help set your pace with intermittent beeps and similar offerings from Citizen with the pacemaker and fun graphics of 1981 Seiko Runner. The Pulsar had been deploying pulse measurement, but it was Seiko's S234 pulse meter in 1983 and similar offerings such as 1984's Citizen Jogpoint and 1987's Casio Pulse Check that would be more successful due to the sports link. The other big contributor to digital watches being more relevant for sporting use was water resistance, which largely began in the early 80s with the Casio Marlin and Swimmer lines, which would go to 30, 50 and 100 metres water resistance. This would take a jump to 200 metres with the 1982 Casio Snorkeler and 300 metres in 1985 with the Casio Tank. 1993's Frogman would be one of the Casio's signature dive watches. Early Citizen water-resistant forward watches were the 9500, 9510 and 9590 range, and Ricoh's Alarm Timer Chrono 827 is one of my favourite of their sportier options with water resistance. When we combine some of these factors, the perfect sport to target is the triathlon, with Timex duly doing so with 1985's Triathlon watch, later to become the Ironman Triathlon, which deserves our 6 Watches of Wonder status, as well as Seiko's 1998 Triathlete SBBE001 and Casio's 1988 Lap Memory Watch. A modern example of this is Garmin with 2016 735 XT, described as triathlon ready. Digital watches have been linked in with the surf scene from the 80s with things like the Freestyle Shark with Velcro straps, but things would become more specific with the 1990 Casio Surf Timer. Nixon would come on the scene from around 1997, with Casio really specialising with the G-Lide range that focused in on tidal displays. Of course, tidal displays came into another sport, fishing, with Casio's 1988 Fishing Time having this, and Timex took a different angle with the Hooks brand that had a tide bezel, temperature sensor and compass built into the strap. Casio have really focused in on fishing over time, including 1996's Fisherman model, and within the ProTrek range with 2003's PAS 400, and the more recent Anglers line with the PRT B70. Some fun skiing focused options were the Casio Wide Temp LC with temperature resistance, 1987 Ski Athlon from Timex, 1989 Citizen D131 with shock sensor, and 1994's Seiko Ski Thermo. Now we've got the display, we can safely use our watch for different activities, but can we be sure of the accuracy of the time wherever we are in the world? Well, dual, multi and world time zone functions are the obvious first place to start. I've seen it claimed that the German company Time Products in 1976 may have produced the first digital dual time zone display. More within the mainstream we have the likes of Casio with the QW16 and the Casiotron X1, with Seiko offerings in the same year including the 0139 and M158 Pan Am. Citizen was also in the game with their dual time 9080, and there was Ricoh's dual time multi-alarm. Advancements on this would be the Seiko FC001 in 1979 and Seiko's 1983 Y951 with dual layer LCD, but that all still largely requires manual setting of the watch. The original setup of radio towers transmitting accurate readings as per an atomic clock were first available in Germany, with Junghans being the first to capitalise and market the Junghans Mega 1 in 1990, our 7th Watch of Wonder. Also in Germany, Casio would launch the FKT 100 in 1994, and Seiko would get into the game in 1998 with the SBJK003 and later S750 radio wave control solar and 5-band SBPG003. It would start getting more elaborate in 2000 with Casio's Ant-Man, Ant being the Ant NI, with later expansion to multiple sites around the world, culminating with the inclusion of China that enabled multiband 6, which would be used with 2008's Casio Riseman and the Classic Square in 2009. An alternative mechanism for correcting time is via GPS, where the timing can be triangulated with the US Department of Defense's satellite network, which started with 24 satellites and now numbers into the hundreds. This was first used by Casio in 1999's Satellite Navi ProTrek range, our 8th Watch of Wonder, with specialism into different sporting disciplines, including Garmin's Forerunner in 2003, which was the forerunner of 2006's Casio GPR 100, and Timex's GPS-enabled Ironman in 2010. Seiko were in the game too, with their GPS-enabled RunSense range, and Ricoh claimed to have the first dedicated GPS surf watch in 2014. Within smartwatch land, Sony's Smartwatch 3 in 2014 would be the first one to integrate GPS. The final part of the bulletproof accurate time time watch was Bluetooth, which meant that you could partner with your phone and update the time that way. The previously mentioned 2010 Sony Ericsson LiveView used Bluetooth, and Casio would introduce it within their range with the 2012 GB6900. Put this all in a pot and you have the Casio 3-way engine that was released in 2017, with GPS, radio control and Bluetooth. Now, telling the time accurately is great, and so is being able to use your watch for different activities, but let's get to its use as a computing resource on your wrist. This starts pretty early with calculator functions. The world of watches and calculators is very intertwined, and one of the reasons for the entry of folks like Casio who arrived from that market. The first examples were in LED watches such as 1975's Pulsar Calculator 901 and later Hewlett-Packard HP01. Within the world of LCD, the grail watch of many is the Citizen Crystron Calc, which arrived in 1977, our ninth watch of wonder, followed fast by the Seiko C153. Even before Casio was in the game, National Semiconductor already had a working scientific calculator watch, but of course, Casio would come in hard from 1980 with the C60 and would largely dominate the market thereafter, with the 1983 Casio Scientific and fun variants such as the 1992 Flip Top. Some cuts from other brands are the Seiko C515, Armatron Wristcomp 101, and the Orient 691000. A critical component for computation is memory, to store data in text and number form, the first main LCD watch to deploy this being the 1978 Seiko Memory Bank. Casio's 1982 TE2500 would be a dictionary watch using memory function. Memory would enable use of calendars too, with Seiko's 1983 D409. The Ricoh 841 alarm calendar is a cool one from them, and remembering telephone numbers would become mainstream and easy with 1985's Casio Databank Telememo. The Databank range would then take off with a vast array of different watches, with capacity for storage becoming greater and navigation becoming easier with touchscreens and filing systems such as the eDatabank. Touchscreen technology would begin with the 1980 Omega Sensor, with later offerings including the 1983 Casio TC5000, 1984's Casio Janus Calc, and 1991's VDB 1000. Memory would also enable the storage of very cool things like the history and future of projected movements of the moon and celestial bodies, which was a factor exploited in the 1985 Casio Moongraph and Cosmophase watches. 2000's Yes Watch I see as somewhat of a spiritual successor to these. A key question that is difficult to untangle is where the wrist computer stops and the smartwatches begin, but I think I've plotted a path that makes sense. The first real wrist computer was 1984's Seiko RC1000, our 10th watch of wonder, with this being upgraded in 1985 with the RC4000 and 4500. The 1988 Wrist Mac is something I only recently became aware of, and it was used to send emails between astronauts on the Atlantis shuttle. Interfacing between a watch and a computer with infrared beam would be the case with the Microsoft and Timex collaboration Datalink in 1994, our 11th watch of wonder, with Casio having its own version with the 1998 HBX 100 PC Unite, and Seiko releasing the Ruputer Pro in 1998. There was a very cool initial prototype project between IBM and Citizen around 2001 with the WatchPad that ran Linux using a QVGA monochrome LCD display. A point which many see as being the time where things jump into smartwatchery is 2004's Microsoft Spot, which was deployed in the Fossil Abacus watch. So we'll take a pause on that one and jump over to some of the other ingredients that make up today's smartwatch. Interaction between communications and watches starts sooner than you might think. A cool one for me is 1987's Casio phone dialer, which uses dial tone multi-frequency or DTMF to dial the numbers on your phone. Paging was one of the earlier intersections, with 1990's Seiko Receptor and Timex getting in on the game later with 1998's Beepware range. Nudging you when your phone was ringing was another angle with 1998's Casio VivCell. Actual phone calls from your watch began with 2000 with this mad looking Samsung SPH WP10, with 2003 seeing the release of NTT Docomo Rismo phone watch. Things would start approaching usability with 2009's Samsung S9110 and LG's GD910. One last element if you think Apple Pay is 2004's Casio SpeedPass, which enabled you to pay using a radio frequency identification device or RFID chip, which was based in the watch, and this could be used at Esso Mobil petrol stations or gas stations, and I believe there were also trials at McDonald's. Now we get into the smartwatches themselves. Early examples which nudge slightly on from those we discussed before: 2011 Motorola Moto Active and 2012 2012 Sony Xperia smartwatch. Partnering with your phone was the norm with 2013's Samsung Galaxy Gear and 2014 with the LG G range, although Timex did have an angle of being a smartwatch without the need for a smartphone with the 2014 GPS 1 Plus watch. Of course, 2015 sees the Apple Watch reign begin, which despite not being the first, I think can still claim to be our 12th watch of wonder. Now all of these functions require power, so let's reverse back again and follow the trail of power source for digital watches. The Noble coin battery is the initial power source. There was a lot of branding linked to the introduction of lithium battery powered watches. It's always plastered on the front of early watches that used it, for example Casio's Module 58 and 65, and the Orient P820-30140 had a lithium battery. The original G-Shock Square around 1983 had the design element of being able to last 10 years on one battery, part of the famous 310s test, so longevity was solved pretty early. The other source of power is the sun. This too was realised early with 1973's Rea Electronics Synchronar 2100, followed by other LEDs such as the 1975 Uranus LED Solar and 1976 Orient LED Solar Quartz. Solar within the LCD world would start with the German company Crystallonic in 1976, which gains our 13th Watch of Wonder slot, closely followed by Sakura's Solar Star Watch. Sakura released another grail for many, which is the VIP 2000 in 1977, with Mundane releasing Digisolar in the same year. Of course, Seiko was involved with the 1978 A156 and Joule Electric and Solar A944, with Orient releasing the 65 800 in the same year. Casio was fairly late in its involvement here, with 1983 being their first solar watch with the Casio SA60G. We would start to see the thinning out of solar cells with the Sanyo developed Morton technology, with Citizen also deploying this heavily in what would become their more analog-focused eco-drive models, with examples being the 1988 Morton PMS300 and Citizen DX80. Junghans in 1993 would link solar with their radio tech to release the Junghans Solar One, and the Tough Solar brand from Casio would release in 1998 with the Raceman model. Another power source that folks sometimes forget in the digital realm is the automatic movement. The first to deploy that was the Ventura Spark FX in 2000, with the later Spark MGS being significantly enhanced in its power generation. A lot of what we've discussed are first movers within the deployment of new tech, so are often quite big blocky things, but more streamlined and compact aesthetics, as well as enhanced design, are other aspects of the technological history of digital watches. There was already a focus on thin from early, with examples like the 1972 NetPro 87 LCD marketing itself as a thin watch, with Seiko's 0439A, Citizen's 9220, and the Braun FW30 focusing on the dress digital market. Coming far from its original big block, Bulliver in 1979 would release the Phantom Super Thin LCD watch, a real luxury item at the time which is hard to find nowadays. The Orient 72110 is a nice example of sports watches looking for that thinner look with the Chrono Slim. Things would start to get super thin with examples using PELA film technology like 1984's Casio FS10. The Sanyo PM2000 was another super thin watch. A more recent example of a brand focusing in on thin is Nixon with the Comp range. In analog world, examples of designers that would develop iconic watches are Roger Talon with the Litmac 2000, Giugiaro with his signature Ripley style Seiko watches, Max Bill at Junghans, Richard Arbib at Hamilton, and of course Gerald Genter with the Royal Oak, amongst others. But the digital watch world also benefited from the presence of influential designers. Ventura's The Watch range from 1989, designed by Fleming Bo Hansen, is an elegant looking watch, and Ventura continued to create beautiful looking watches with the Spark range, Hannes Wettstein designing the Easy Scroll system, and Simon Hussein producing cool typography, which have crossed over to the design of Braun watches, and you can see echoes in the recent Allez El Capitan watch. Seiko had some other interesting designs such as the Air Pro from 1997 and Seiko H Timetron from 1999. Tokyo Flash and Sea Hope have some of the most insane looking watches you're likely to find. Their invasion into the digital watch world began from around 2000. The Citizen Independent range and Seiko Alba are other more youthful oriented watches with crazy designs. Casio have some beautiful looking watches within their MRG range, leveraging Japanese traditional techniques, as well as regular collaborations with artists for limited editions, particularly within the G-Shock range. We've got to watches that display accurate time, have multiple functions for your different activities, and have computational power. Now let's get into those things that feed even more data into that watch, Sensors. The first main sensor type used in digital watches may be a prototype, which is 1977's crystallonic temperature watch, but the mainstream release of note is the 1982 Citizen Anadigi Temp, our 14th wonder of watches, closely followed by Casio with the TS1000 range. Seiko was quite a while later, I believe, with 1991's W700, and a slightly different angle was the 1991 thermal scanner from Casio, which they'd used within their ProTrek range as well. Timex had a temperature function within their reef gear range from 1997. The next sensor is the pressure sensor that can serve a few different purposes. 1985's Citizen Aqualand was the first mainstream watch to include a digital readout of depth that wasn't one of the old school dive computers. Casio had a slightly different format of reading out depth with the 1986 depth gauge, with Seiko having the first so-called computerized diving watch with the 1990s Scuba Master, a precursor to their 2000 diving computer watch. Citizen wouldn't rest on its laurels from being first and would also move on to the 1994 Hyper Aqualand, a watch I intend to acquire, and 2001's Cyber Aqualand. Another operator to be aware of in the same space is Sunto with 2004's D9 all-in-one dive computer. The other function that the pressure sensor enables is calculation of altitude by cross-referencing pressure readings to standard international atmosphere. These watches are more targeted at mountaineers and climbers, and Casio's Alti-Depth was the first here. I think in 1987, with Citizen having the Altachron series in 1989 with the C40 and C46. Seiko had a slightly later model with the W730 Alti memory, and did make a relatively recent digital alpinist in 2014, the SBEB001 with altimeter, and 2016's SBEL007 which included compass. The more raw readout of pressure readings was also positioned as being of benefit for predicting weather, and will be leveraged by Casio within their 1987 barometer BM100, BM500 weather station, and the 200 and 600 models. The third type of sensor into the mix is terrestrial magnetism readouts, which Casio would use in the 1993 CPW 100 and 200 range. The Master of G iteration was the Wademan, released in 1999. Seiko-owned Loris had this number, the W800. Modern compass-focused watches are the Wenger Nomad and Victorinox ST5000. Step tracking is something that also had an evolution. The Polar PE2000 combined ECG and a chest strap and was available from 1982, with the PE3000 being released in 1984. Within the mainstream, a watch that linked steps to burn calories was the 1987 Calorie Pedometer EXW50 and 1990 Jog and Walk Calorie JC10, as well as the Seiko SBDE001. There were models within the early ProTrek range, such as the PRT60 from 1998, that had a step counter based on a vibration sensor, but the watch couldn't be worn and would have to hang free for it to work. Fitbit would come into the fray in 2009, which most folks would refer to when you think about step counters, which would use an accelerometer. Smartwatch-style watches themed around this area would include the Epson J300, Casio ProTrek's WSD F10, and Citizen's CZ smartwatch. Before we start bundling sensors together, a couple of others to mention are blood pressure monitor watches, with the BP100 in 1990. That runs a current through your body and reads fluctuations in your finger to calculate systolic and diastolic pressure. Light sensors in the various smartwatches are reading blood pressure, with a more specific modern watch focused on this being the Omron Heart Guide. More obscure is ultraviolet sensors with the Casio UV100 in 1987, and even light sensors with the Citizen Spectro in 1983. The first twin sensor, in this case combining temperature and pressure sensors, that I'm aware of is Casio's 1992 ALT 6000 and 6100 Alti Thermo. Seiko would do this within their dive watch range with thermometer and depth gauge in 1995 with the Scuba 200. The one I know from Citizen is 1999's C900 Amphibian with altimeter, depth meter, and thermometer. Triple sensor, which added a direction bearing sensor into the pressure sensor and thermometer, would begin with the 1994 ATC 1100, our 15th watch of wonder, which would morph into the ProTrek range with the DPX 500. The Sunto Vector in 1998 provides another example of a triple sensor watch, and a tough solar-enabled version of triple sensor would arrive in 2002, with substantial miniaturization and efficacy being enabled in 2013, with triple sensor version 3 in the PRW 3000. I believe Seiko's multi-sensor watch range was within the Alpinist series, with this SBEB 0013, 15, 17, 19 and 35. A modern range with triple sensor is the High Gear range. This would go up to 4 sensors where either a depth gauge would be included, as with the 2016 Golfmaster, or an accelerometer for step counting with the 2019 ProTrek PRT B50. The final bit of the puzzle, using watches to bring things to our attention and for entertainment. The first block of this is the mighty alarm, beginning with LCD watches in 1976 with the Citizen Crystron alarm, which is a range they would build on with the 1978 multi-alarm, 1979's multi-alarm 2, and the later multi-alarm 3. Seiko's offering here would be the A029, with Casio's first alarm being the Casiotron QW25. The world of melody alarms would arrive courtesy of Orient in 1979 with the Orient multi-music alarm, Seiko with the A169, and Casio launching their melody alarm model in 1980. Ricoh would have a music chrono with the 820 reference. For more complex sounds, it was actually surprisingly early that this was enabled, and by different folks than you might imagine. This was radio watches. These were first produced as far back as 1976 by Asia International Electronics. Some different names operated in the space like Nelsonic, Sinclair, and Pyro. The more standard brands would also have watches here like the 1985 Citizen DO31 Soundwitch, the Casio TM1000, and Sanyo's radio watch R10P. Talking watches that told you the time were also a thing, with an early example being British company Trafalgar's 1200 talking watch in 1981. Seiko produced the Y823 and later examples of talking watches with the 1986 Vox watch. Voice recording would come online with the 1983 M516 voice recorder, with Casio launching the Easy Rec mode and Citizen bringing the voice memo in 1985 and seriously cool voice recognition watch in 1987, the VX2. But what about the gamers? Well, there were crude gaming watches from early with the 1977 Unitrex Monte Carlo and Meister Anker slot machine. In the more mainstream range was Casio with the 1981 GM10 and GM20. Seiko would follow soon after with the Y666, Y700 and Y760, with the Alba range having the 822. Orient, in some of its last watches on the market before its decline in this area, had some game watches from 1981, including Space Wars, with Nelsonic being very present within this field too. An amazing advance in 1982 was Seiko's television watch with the T001, our 16th watch of wonder. The best Casio could do nearly a decade later was the wrist remote that enabled you to change the TV channel, but they were at the forefront in 2000 with their wrist camera, the WQV1, our final watch of wonder slot. It would later be available in colour with the WQV03. Casio would also lead the digital music space with the 2001 Casio MP3 player, with other related tech being the 2007 iControl from Timex that could change your iPod setting. Now for the final fun part, some analysis of what this means for the brands and the countries they represent in the Illuminating Watches Tech Tree Civilization leaderboard. Countries contributing to the most were Japan with 8, US with 7, Germany with 2, and Switzerland with 1. Brands contributing the most watches of wonder are Casio with 4, Timex with 3, Seiko with 2, and Citizen with 2. It's not a perfect science, but if we look at the number of mentions I've given to different brands, these are Casio, Seiko, Citizen, Timex, Orient, Ricoh, Junghans, Omega, and Sanyo. And that's it for today's video. I hope you've enjoyed it, and if you want to dig deeper into Casio watches, this video here will tell you everything that you need to know in 10 minutes.